In fact, we did an investigation about 18 months ago, which revealed the propaganda efforts that the Iranians are going to. And they include some quite sophisticated methods involving bot armies, involving even fake news websites. There was one called the Herald Tribune, which George Galloway wrote for. It was an Iranian front news website. As we move into a more and more polarized geopolitical environment, and they're unleashing propaganda as well as weaponry and physical subversion. I mean, we're seeing, the thing that I often think about is that when I project over the next 10 years, it's easier to imagine widespread war than it is to imagine widespread peace across the world.
You think it's easy to imagine Russian missiles being launched at London?
Nobody was able to imagine Russian missiles launched at Ukraine. I mean, even in the days before the Ukraine war, if you think back, all the commentators and the analysts said, no, though, the build-up of thousands of Russian troops, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops and assets on the Ukrainian border, it's just saber-rattling. They wouldn't dare. There's a sense of complacency, our sort of post-war peace dividend complacency that means that we think it could never happen.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. Jew hatred is a shape-shifting virus. As the late, great British Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks powerfully noted, the Jews used to be hated for their religion, then they were hated for their race, and today they are hated for their state. We can stop trying to count angels dancing on the head of a pin. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are the same thing. Hatred of Israel is driven by the same mindset that has driven centuries of hatred of Jews. Hatred of Israel simply is hatred of most of the world's Jews. Zionist has become a dirty word to describe anyone who thinks that Jews should have a homeland and not be killed in a nuclear holocaust. My guest today is editor-in-chief of the Jewish Chronicle and author of Israelophobia, a seemingly prophetic book that came out just a month before Hamas started this war. Jake Wallis Simons joins me for an in-depth discussion of why the Middle East's only democracy, which uniquely respects the rights of women and sexual and religious minorities, is such a red flag for the red-green alliance of far leftists and Islamists. We sit down to detail who the Israelophobes are and what the rise of the UK Labour Party back into power means. Seeing how Israelophobes use modern digital media to disseminate an ancient hatred of Jews, and why those across the liberal democratic world fail to align with their natural allies, the State of Israel, and their increasingly isolated Jewish communities at home. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage. Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon. What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this? Where does this go?
Jake Wallis Simons, welcome to State of a Nation.
Great to be here.
I've heard of anti-Semitism. I've heard of anti-Zionism. I've heard of anti-Judaism. What is Israelophobia?
Well, Israelophobia is an attempt to try and clean up the debate. Because you know what it's like when you come across somebody who is obsessively hateful towards Israel. We've all met them on social media and in real life. And whenever you say, why do you hate Israel so much? They say, well, I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm not anti-Semitic. Look, I've got a Jewish friend. As if having a Jewish friend is a price worth paying to avoid the accusation of being an anti-Semite. I've got a Jewish friend, and the Jewish friend is obviously, a hard left kind of mascot, fig leaf for these guys. So you say, okay, well, you're an anti-Zionist. And they say, yeah, what's wrong with being an anti-Zionist? And you end up going down a rabbit hole with that debate, and the point gets lost, which is, why do you hate this country so much more than any other country, including the 100 odd that are far, far worse, or more, that are far worse in terms of human rights and all the rest of it? And so the idea of Israelophobia is to bring to the fore the fact that, look, let's forget about talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the distinction between them. You hate this country. You hate this country. If you hated France or Venezuela or Nigeria or China, that would also be wrong. Why this country? Why do you hate this country? What's your problem with Israel?
And what is that problem with Israel? Because many of them would say, no, it's not a phobia. First of all, I'm definitely not scared of it, but it's not irrational. It's rational. I have very good reasons to hate the state of Israel because it's guilty of A, B, C, D. What answers do you find?
Well, I mean, phobia, I was really trying to resonate with things like, xenophobia and homophobia rather than arachnophobia. So it's like a dislike rather than a fear. But I think
Israel's more like foreigners and gay people than it is spiders.
I think in the mind of the Israelophobe, perhaps, yes. And I think that, they might say, well, I've got a reason to fear Israel or a reason to dislike Israel. But the point is that those reasons rest on lies. The same kind of lies that have powered anti-Semitism for 2,000 years. So I'm not saying that Israelophobia is different from anti-Semitism. I'm simply saying that, as the former chief rabbi, the late chief rabbi Lord Sachs put it, in the Middle Ages, Jews were hated for their religion as the Christ killers. In the 20th century, they were hated for their race as Untermenschen, as an inferior race. And now they're hated in a political sense for their nation state. But it's the same tropes that come through. So in the Middle Ages, the blood libel that began in Norwich in 1144, Jews like killing babies. Fast forward to 2024, and somehow Israel likes killing babies. It's the same idea, but it's a lie, isn't it? It's a lie. The idea that Israel is a genocidal, all-powerful ethnic cleansing state, which has a Zionist lobby that pulls the strings of foreign governments and the money markets. These are all familiar tropes. And the reason that these anti-Semites, these Israelophobes, hate Israel so much is that they base their perception of Israel on these lies, these age-old lies that are centuries old.
You just used those two terms, anti-Semites and Israelophobes, interchangeably. As far as you're concerned, Israelophobia is simply the latest incarnation of anti-Semitism? Exactly.
I mean, the book is called Israelophobia, and the subtitle is the newest version of the oldest hatred and what to do about it. So it is the same. I'm not saying it's different. It's just the latest evolution. Anti-Semitism is a shape-shifting thing. It finds a way to become acceptable to society and to pose as a virtue. So when society was dominated by religious observance,
that's a good point.
It posed as a religious virtue. We're killing the Jews, oppressing them, torturing them, expelling them, marginalizing them because they killed Christ. So therefore, we're the good guys. In the 20th century, when Jews were perceived as being an inferior race, we're just seeking to cleanse the world of this malicious subhuman influence for the sake of our children. Even the SS were trying to brainwash themselves that they were doing a good thing for the world by massacring Jews and committing a genocide. And now the latest form of anti-Semitism, people who are infested with Israelophobia tell themselves and tell the world, we're the good guys, because Israel is a genocidal, white supremacist apartheid state. Therefore, we are standing up against them. We're the good guys. And it's amazing how many people buy that.
You live in a country in the UK that has seen mass protests almost every Saturday by large anti-Israel, I would say, pro-Hamas crowds through the streets of London. Definitely very loud, very vocal. I'm wondering, to what extent is the UK an Israelophobic society?
That's a really important question. And I think that I still think that it's a vocal minority. I feel like the center of gravity in Britain is not anti-Semitic or Israelophobic. But the problem is, as is the case across the Western world, the problem is the silence of the silent majority. You might have a majority who is not anti-Semitic, who looks at these protests and this activism online and on television and in our streets with a raised eyebrow, with a sense of some disdain. And with good reason, because they are against British values as much as they're against the Jews. We can talk about that perhaps separately, but they attack the statue of Winston Churchill and the Union flag and the Cenotaph War Memorial when they do their marches against Israel. So it's about something deeper. But I think that most people look on that with some distaste. But there's a difference between that looks a bit wrong, let's go and watch the football, and that looks a bit wrong, let's stand up to it.
Except this isn't really a fringe minority opinion across all demographics. And in fact, I saw in your own paper, the Jewish Chronicle, the astonishing headline that over half of Britons in the 18 to 35 demographic think that Israel has no right to exist. And only a fifth of young Brits disagreed with that remark. Does this polling seem credible to you? How did we get to a situation where half of Britons within my age range think that this country has no right to exist?
You're right. I mean, it's a terrifying and sobering statistic. And certainly as you go down the age range, Israelophobia becomes more and more potent. It's a very different story in the over 65s, and it goes down the spectrum like that. And it's terrifying. And I think that a big part of it is social media. Young people tend not to read the news or access the news via traditional channels. They see it on TikTok. And TikTok and other platforms are largely influenced heavily by the anti-Israel movement. Now, whether that's because TikTok is owned by the Chinese Communist Party and they have algorithms that put their thumb on the scale in a direction that's going to destabilize the West, I haven't seen any actual evidence of that, but it seems like the theory might be likely true. But either way, there's a hugely subversive influence coming from social media. I mean, my daughter, my daughter's 16 years old, and when the meme went round, all eyes on Rafah, you remember that? It was shared, 47 million times, something like that. All of her friends, she doesn't go to a Jewish school, we don't live in a Jewish area. All of her friends were sharing it on Instagram. And she said to me, Dad, can you help me find something that is pro-Israel that can push back on this? Because I can't find anything. Help me find something on Instagram that I can begin to share and send to my friends, because they're all sharing it. They don't even know what Rafah means. They don't know what it is, but they're all sharing it. She's been to Israel. She knows a little bit about it. She wanted to push back, but she couldn't find the tools to push back. And I think this is a terrifying phenomenon, because it is, influencing the soft matter of our young people's brains outside of parental oversight and outside of the grown-up world, as it were. We live in a world of mainstream media. They live in a world of TikTok, and it's getting them.
Is there a way to bring back the young generation and make them understand the importance of Israel within the Western alliance, or do we have to write off the next generation of Britons?
Well, I think that's a very deep question. I think that the problem is a very profound one, because it's not just about Israel. As I was alluding to earlier, the marches that go through London, they target symbols of Britain, of the British state, of the British way of life. And the Jews and Israel are the most vivid expression of a liberal democratic way of life. And that's what's being attacked. That's what is viewed with hostility by, some people call it woke. I call it the new radicalism, woke plus Islamism, this weird alliance that we're facing now. And young people, there was some polling just a couple of weeks ago, which revealed that young people, the majority of people in Britain, and indeed across the Western world, would not fight to defend their country if it was invaded. We've had suggestions in Britain of conscription being brought in. It's been treated with mockery and disdain.
Well, by the way, it's very entertaining while Israel is fighting for its life and discussing the question of expanding the draft to the ultra-Orthodox so that they can actually fight, that Britain's version of conscription is 1 weekend of volunteering a month for a year. This is the discussion that's taking place in Britain.
Exactly. And if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it.
Exactly. It's compulsory unless you don't want to.
I think what this shows is that, British young people and young people across the West have lost touch with what it means to be fighting for your life, to be at war. We've forgotten over the generations. We've become complacent at a time when the dangers are growing internationally from Russia and China and Iran and their allies. And so, the luxury of hating Israel, which is the one country, along with Ukraine perhaps, that is standing up and putting its lives on the line, the lives of its boys on the line.
And Taiwan against China.
For our values. It's a luxury belief to disdain it and to hate it. It's a luxury belief to say, I wouldn't fight. I would accept it. It's a luxury belief. But I think that if and when, God forbid, they actually do face war on their shores, which isn't unlikely in the next 10 years, then there might be a huge sea change where they realize actually fighting for your life is something that you need to do.
Douglas Murray sat on the seat you're sitting in just a while ago on the podcast, and he made the point about the exact same poll showing that most young Britons would not fight for their country, that it was only shortly before the Second World War that the Oxford Union voted this house would not fight for king and country, and yet when the clouds of war reached the shores of Britain and they were tested, they rose to the challenge, and one can only hope that if such horrific circumstances afflicted Britain, the young generation would snap to it. But you say that this hostility towards Israel is a luxury belief, which I think is a fascinating insight and speaks to the complacency that the West has been allowed to lure itself into thanks to the post Second World War, post-Cold War peace. But I don't share your optimism that Britain has the luxury of ignoring what is happening on its own streets. Let's just watch a short clip from late October last year, shortly after the 10/7 massacre, of people calling for jihad on the streets of London.
What is the solution to liberate people in the concentration camps of Palestine?
Jihad!
What is the solution?
Jihad!
Allah
Jihad! Jihad!
Those videos shocked many people. Not really the Metropolitan Police, which in response to cries of jihad, put out this tweet that was subjected to a great deal of ridicule, saying, "The word jihad has a number of meanings, but we know the public will most commonly associate it with terrorism. We have specialist counter-terrorism officers here in the operations room who have particular knowledge in this area. They've assessed the video filmed at the Hizb ut-Tahrir protest in central London and have not identified any offences arising from the specific clip." Okay, one can say that people are talking about jihad in the nice way, and when they called on Muslim armies to rise up and free Palestine, maybe they meant jihad in the sense of an inner personal struggle. But do the UK authorities get it? Do they understand what fanaticism has been unleashed on the streets of London?
Look, I mean, it's total idiocy. It's the idiocy of the lambs to the slaughter, that tweet. And if I was coming across as optimistic about that, that was a mistaken perception. I take it very seriously indeed. It's a grave situation whereby the Metropolitan Police, there is this idea of two-tier policing in Britain, whereby, you know, if you're a far-right mob going through London for St George's Day, you will receive batons, truncheons, riot helmets and horses. But if you're calling for jihad on the streets, you'll receive a cup of tea and a pat on the back. And I'm exaggerating slightly, but not by much. I mean, you know, in the early days after October the 7th...
Cup of tea and a pat on the back, that sounds like quite severe exaggeration.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, you had rioters in the streets of London in the weeks after October the 7th, climbing scaffolding, climbing statues, giving their flags, giving their flags to police officers holding their flags, waiting for them to come down, giving them back their flags, say, okay, on you go, and then tweeting, don't worry, they're safe. I mean, that's the sort of policing we're talking about. Is it a cup of tea? No. Is it a pat on the back? Yes, literally a pat on the back. It's
so why
dangerous.
Don't they get it?
It's dangerous. And
why don't they get
I mean, look, the clip that you played from Hizb ut-Tahrir, that group is now a proscribed terrorist organisation since that was taken in Britain. So the government is taking some action. The police don't get it, I think, partly because it's part of this kind of effort to be multicultural, this effort to be friendly towards minorities, that is being turned against us in our naivety by hostile actors and by people who do have hostile designs on our country. You know, as I described, this new radicalism, this alliance of radical views on race, on gender, on climate, and on Palestine. The first thing they do is try to undermine your confidence in yourself, in your own history, in your own judgment and national character. So people have been brainwashed for decades that just because you're British and you're white, you are therefore racist. Your history is colonialist and imperialist. You are infused with racism, unconscious bias. And that has deadly results. For example, the Manchester Arena bombing in 2018, I believe it was. I happened to be there as a journalist. A few minutes afterwards, I was covering another story right down the road, came upon it. The perpetrator, Salman Abedi, who wore this backpack filled with explosives, went out, detonated it, killed scores of children at this Ariana Grande concert. The inquest found that a security guard had seen him coming in, thought he looked suspicious, but then thought, no, that's just me being Islamophobic. I'm being racist, therefore I'm going to stand back, allow him to go in with those lethal results. We have been sort of groomed to doubt ourselves, to believe that we're racist when we are not. And therefore we are losing the capacity to act normally and in defence of our values. I think that's what we're seeing with the culture in the Metropolitan Police on the streets.
And that's a question that disturbs me more broadly about the ability of mainstream society, not just in Britain, but in other liberal democracies, to really come to terms with the fanaticism and glorification of violence that is being expressed through these anti-Israel protests, but of course will not simply end there. Whatever begins with the Jews never ends there. And when this war started and we saw the large protest through London, I tweeted that London had never seen such a large parade of rape apologists before. And that really rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. My colleague Mark Regev was asked on Sky News to explain why I was calling them rape apologists. And I was trying to shock British public out of its complacency, explain to them the meaning of what it is to demand a ceasefire with Hamas still on its feet, still holding hostages. And to say, if you do not get a grip and understand what madness has been unleashed on your streets and what they represent, someone will. And there will be a backlash that will come from the right, from the far right even. And that's not going to be good for your societies if the far right sees these large protests of people calling for jihad through the streets of your capital city. They see mainstream society sticking its head in the sand like an ostrich, refusing to take it seriously. There will be a backlash, and that backlash is not going to be good for your liberal democratic values. Is your sense that mainstream Britain, since October 7th, is beginning to clock what madness is happening on its streets?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the problem isn't the rape apologists. The problem is the apologists for the rape apologists. The actual rape apologists are in the minority. The people who go out and support Hamas overtly and commit that criminal act in Britain, they're in the minority on these protests. But the apologists for them, the people who give them legitimacy by accompanying them on those marches and not objecting and not saying, no, that's not okay, and sort of persuade themselves that going on a march that doesn't call for peace, there isn't a single person calling for peace, without a single person calling for the release of the hostages, without a single person expressing any concern at all for anybody other than the Palestinian kids that they see on their TV screens, that's somehow a march for peace. And so that's the problem. And it keys into the propaganda which comes out all over social media and television, which we're, I suppose, going to talk about shortly. But in terms of the far right, in Britain, there is not much of a far right scene. Unlike in the States, unlike in Germany and across Europe, Britain is not known for its far right presence. Probably the furthest you can get to, or the closest you can get to a far right figure may be Tommy Robinson, or maybe some people might say Nigel Farage, which is not, by comparison to the far right figures you have elsewhere in the world, is pretty tame and probably shouldn't really be in the same bracket in terms of the lethality of the threat. So Britain isn't known for its fascism. It's had fascism in the past, of course. Oswald Mosley and Jews stood up to him in Brick Lane, famously, in the 30s. But on the whole, Britain isn't a fascist place. So I think it would take a huge amount for Britain to have some kind of far-right revolution in response to this.
And let's hope that never happens.
And let's hope that never happens. What we want to see is Britain as a whole rediscovering a new confidence in the liberal democratic values that made the West so successful and such a fantastic place to live, to the extent that millions of people want to come and live here from elsewhere in the world. We need people
By here, you mean Britain, not Israel?
Well, I mean, Israel is culturally a Western-style liberal democracy. And, okay, you don't have millions of migrants from Africa and the Middle East wanting to come here, or if you do, they can't get it. But yeah, that's a European.
Well, we do. They call themselves European refugees.
But yes, I mean, in terms of the values that underpin our society in Britain, in the States, across Europe, and here, they are the same. And people need to understand that Israel is responding on our behalf against an enemy that we share. And Israel is first in the firing line, but we will be next. And if we don't develop the ability to stand up for our values and to learn what it means to defend ourselves, then the future will be very bleak indeed.
Do you see that as part of your journalistic mission as the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Chronicle, to help British society, non-Jewish British society, rediscover that self-confidence and commitment to its values?
Look, I mean, the Jewish Chronicle is for the Jewish community. It's not the job of the paper to try to remedy society at large. I have enough on my hands covering the Jewish community and trying to project it properly. But what we do is try to address those threats that face the Jewish community, of which there are many and multiplying since October the 7th. The paper has, has recipes, it has culture, it has art, it has
a fantastic
humor.
Crossword.
It has a good crossword, a Shabbat puzzle. It has community stuff, it has religion. But at the front, at the sharp end, it has a fantastic investigative unit which exposes the Islamism and the anti-Semitism that is a threat to all of the Jewish community.
And do you find that your reporting and investigative work is making inroads within the rest of the British media, that people are picking up on what the Jewish Chronicle is reporting? Or do you find you're in a silo, other people don't know, don't care, don't want to know?
Well, look, I mean, we plough that furrow more than anybody else. We cover more stories with regard to Islamism, with regard to the Iranian influence in Britain than any other media outlet. But yes, our stories are frequently picked up and projected by the mainstream. I'll give you an example. Last year, we exposed the fact that British universities were sharing cutting-edge drone research with the Iranians. They were doing collaborations on basically military-grade cutting-edge drone
What do you mean they were
technology.
sharing the intelligence with the Iranians?
They were working, not intelligence, but research. They were sharing technological research in joint projects with Iranian universities. The same tech that we see deployed in drones across Ukraine and elsewhere. I don't need to mention where in the Middle East it's deployed. So we exposed that in the beginning of the week. On the Wednesday, at Prime Minister's Questions, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, got up and announced an inquiry into that because of our reporting. Now, that inquiry has not concluded. It's been a year. It's been too long. We keep hassling them. They keep telling us that it's underway. But that's just one example of how our reporting has cut through, has informed the mainstream agenda up to the Prime Minister's desk, and we're trying to effect change to keep everybody safe.
You mentioned Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. We're recording this episode while he is still Prime Minister, but in all likelihood, barring any surprises by the time this episode is released, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will be one Sir Keir Starmer. And barring any surprises, the Labour Party, which has been out of power since 2010, is going to win a landslide after very many years in the political wilderness. Now, Sir Keir Starmer has done an impressive job of purging the party of the Corbynite far left, trying to change its position on Israel. But what will a Labour victory and a Labour landslide in the UK mean for the UK-Israel relationship?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that in Labour's manifesto, it pledges to recognise a state of Palestine before negotiations are concluded. This is a major policy change, would be a major policy change for the UK. Now, there's some wiggle room there, there's some grey area, because Sir Keir Starmer has said that it would only be at a time when Israel would be secure. And so there's a get-out clause. It's broader than the headline, if you like. But nonetheless, there's enough bandwidth there to pivot, to kind of keep, to satisfy perhaps the concerns of Jews, but also satisfy the concerns of Labour's Muslim voters and activists. But I think, seen from the point of view of the Jewish community, that policy departure is very serious and is very worrying, because it seems to be of a piece with foreign policy posturing, rather than looking at the reality on the ground, which is, 71% of Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza support October the 7th. And if that doesn't mean a security risk that would be exacerbated by by a Palestinian state, I don't know what does.
So what then can we expect to see from a Labour government? Definitely the call to recognise a Palestinian state unilaterally shifts the Overton window, creates pressure to go in that direction. Is Israel heading on a diplomatic collision course with the UK?
Good question. I think people don't really know what to expect from a Labour government, certainly from a Jewish point of view, because Sir Keir Starmer was one of Jeremy Corbyn's longest-serving shadow cabinet members. He campaigned to put him in number 10.
Although he said in one of the recent leadership debates that he was convinced they would lose in 2019. And
he now says he only supported Corbyn because he knew he was going to lose, which sort of implies that here's a man who can tell the world that he has beliefs that he doesn't have for political expediency over a long period. That's politics, of course, but there's politics and there's politics. And this is quite an extreme example of that. Somebody who can support the agenda of the hard left for year upon year, and then win the leadership and then purge the party of the hard left and bring it to the centre.
Played his cards very well,
but now he's bringing the party to the centre. Is that because that aligns with his true beliefs, or is it because he understands that that's where you win elections? That's how you win elections. Once he gains power, what will we see? I'm not talking about my own perspective. I'm talking about the perspective of many in the Jewish community. You know, the Jewish Chronicle just this week published some polling of British Jews, which shows that Rishi Sunak is just about ahead. The Tories are just about ahead in the Jewish vote, ahead of Labour, which is probably the only demographic in the entire country, given that the Tories are so far behind, you know, facing electoral obliteration. So many Jews are convinced that there's been a huge swing to Labour in the Jewish community since the Corbyn years. Don't get me wrong. Many
Is the community now roughly divided half-half between the Conservatives and the Labour Party?
You know, Labour is just behind the Tories in the figures that we published this week, just behind. So there's been a huge swing of like 50 points, something like that, to Labour since Keir Starmer took over. And he has done an extraordinary job in rooting out the far left and the Israelophobes and the Anti-Semites from his parliamentary party at the very least, and to some extent in the membership. So let's give him credit for that. And let's cross our fingers that is the real him, and that he will continue to do that once he's elected. In terms of the Israel-UK bilateral relationship, there are concerns there. Where
do you identify those concerns? Because from my perspective, I see the prospect of the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants against the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister, and Britain saying that it would abide by those, which would make it impossible for Prime Minister Netanyahu to visit the UK, increasing pressure on the UK to suspend arms sales to Israel, although I'm pretty sure that Israel sells more arms to the UK than the other way around. What other landmines do you identify that whoever is in government in Israel is going to have to navigate around a Labour government?
Well, I mean, the ICC, the International Criminal Court case, the attempt to get an arrest warrant against Bibi and Yoav Gallant, Labour supports that. The Tories have been very clear that they would not abide by it even if it was issued. But David Lammy, the shadow Foreign Secretary, who will be almost certainly Foreign Secretary, supports that effort. And so that's a major a difference, a clear blue water between the two parties. And it's something that would be very, very difficult if it were to come to pass.
Are you saying a Labour government means an inevitable diplomatic crisis with Israel?
I think I wouldn't say inevitable, but I would say that the chances are raised. I mean, there are strong cries for ceasefire now from within Labour activists and in many Labour seats in the north. It looks like Keir Starmer will win a sizable enough majority not to have to bend to the demands of special interest groups from the far left or from Islamists. But there's a question mark over it. You know, he's resisted calls for ceasefire so far. How long will he resist? The ICC case is another. Arms sales, I mean, again, that's just posturing. The percentage is so tiny.
But it's dangerous posturing because, as your former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, wrote in a column, those who are saying that Britain should not sell arms to Israel are saying that no right-thinking country should sell arms to Israel, and they're saying that Israel should therefore be left defenseless and vulnerable in the face of Iran and its proxy armies trying to destroy it on
I mean, look, fronts. I mean, if we have President Biden in the White House after November, and we have Sir Keir Starmer in Downing Street, which we almost certainly will, and Labour decides to suspend arms sales to Israel, you know, President Biden doesn't need very much encouragement to go in that direction himself. He's shown over the last few months. So yes, it could have a knock-on effect.
I'm interested more broadly when we look at the turn against Israel in the UK, in the United States, to try to understand where it is coming from. We mentioned before TikTok, but there's certainly the intervention of other hostile actors around the world. We had Suella Braverman, former British Home Secretary, here on the podcast as well, speaking about the role of Iranian gangs in executing political violence on the streets of the UK. And I wonder, in particular from your investigative work at the Jewish Chronicle, what role you see Iran playing in destabilizing and subverting British public opinion.
A major role. In fact, we did an investigation about 18 months ago, which revealed the propaganda efforts that the Iranians are going to, mainly online, the kind of digital influence, digital warfare. And they include some quite sophisticated methods involving bot armies, involving even fake news websites. There was one called, I believe, the Herald Tribune, which George Galloway wrote for. It was an Iranian Front news website.
And The Guardian is, I'm kidding.
Let's not go there. But yes, I mean, in terms of propaganda alone, it's significant. And we haven't even got to the actual physical thuggery on the streets of Britain and elsewhere in the West, where Iranian dissidents are targeted. We had an Iranian dissident journalist stabbed in London just a few weeks ago by, we think, a regime, either goons hired by the regime or IRGC operatives. We've had bomb plots carried out by the IRGC, which have been foiled in Paris a couple of years ago and elsewhere. So the threat is really serious. It's the Iranians who are trying to, who are one of the main players in trying to subvert British democracy.
And what other actors do you see also trying to subvert British democracy and public opinion, in particular by poisoning public opinion against Israel? Well,
I mean, it's the new axis, isn't it? It's the Iranians, it's the Chinese, and it's the Russians, and their fans and their friends. Those are the three main state actors who are developing this axis. Their interests are aligning increasingly as we move into a more and more polarized geopolitical environment, and they're unleashing propaganda as well as weaponry and subversion and physical subversion. I mean, we're seeing, the thing that I often think about is that when I project over the next 10 years, it's easier to imagine widespread war than it is to imagine widespread peace across the world. For example, just one scenario off the top of my head, China invades Taiwan. It was carrying out war games just last week, simulating a surrounding Taiwan with drones. China invades Taiwan. The Americans send some military assets to the region, a couple of aircraft carrier strike groups or whatever, as they did with Israel. Then Hezbollah ramps up its attacks. The Iranians launch another missile attack on Israel, which is now no longer unprecedented. The Americans split their fleet or send some more assets here, stretching them across the region, across the world. Then Russia sees the opportunity and invades Moldova or Estonia or Poland, fires some missiles at London. And we haven't even mentioned North Korea. Suddenly, NATO's activated and you have a global conflagration. Now, that's just one scenario that's easier to imagine, actually, given the way that things are going, than peace.
You think it's easy to imagine Russian missiles being launched at London?
It's easy to imagine, of course.
Why?
For the same reason that nobody was able to imagine Russian missiles launched at Ukraine. I mean, even in the days before the Ukraine war, if you think back, all the commentators and the analysts said, no, though, the build-up of thousands of Russian troops, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops and assets on the Ukrainian border is just saber-rattling. They wouldn't dare. There's a sense of complacency, our sort of post-war peace dividend complacency that means that we think it could never happen.
No, but these scenarios are completely different because in the case of Russian missile attacks on London, Russia would be declaring war on another nuclear power, and in the case of Ukraine, it was not.
Sure, but look, we are seeing Russia edge closer and closer to full-on confrontation with NATO, testing the boundaries, almost week after week. Britain gets buzzed by Russian planes regularly, as do other parts of the NATO alliance. Russia is constantly seeing how far it can push things before there is a response. Will there be a response? And the message that NATO keeps giving back is, we're going to play defense. The same with the Iranians here in Israel. When Iran shot all those 300 or whatever it was projectiles in April into Israeli airspace, we played defense. We didn't play offense. And the Israeli response was measured and it sent a message. But the message it sent was, these are our capabilities, not this is the pain we can cause. It was a message of fear, not pain. And the same policy with respect to Iran has been conducted by the Biden White House in trying to appease the Iranians in the hope that they won't hurt us anymore. And of course, we all know what happens with appeasement. History tells us that. And so I think overall, we're seeing a complacent West with a policy of appeasement against an enemy that is pushing the boundaries further and further. I think it wouldn't be impossible in a scenario that I just described, where those different dominoes all fall in sequence, to imagine a missile being fired on London.
I wonder whether you think that the increasing instability of the global order is what will ultimately push Western countries to support Israel more strongly. Because if you look at the global map, there are now 3 countries that are effectively threatened with extinction by aggressive neighbors. Israel at the hands of Iran and its proxy armies that are now attacking us on 7 fronts. Ukraine at the hands of Russia, and Taiwan, not recognized as a separate sovereign state, but for all intents and purposes, at the hands of China. And I hope this would happen after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that suddenly the language of fighting for democracy, fighting for freedom, fighting for your home, fighting for borders, would begin to resonate in the West in a way that would shift the discourse to a place that suddenly matches what Israel has been saying. What Israel has been saying about defending borders and our home and fighting for our lives and our freedom and our democracy would suddenly make sense, because that is what the world was saying about Ukraine. And that hasn't quite happened yet. But I do wonder whether increasing aggression by not just Iran here, but by Russia and potentially China, and it does look like the world is going in that direction, will make Western countries more sympathetic to Israel's predicament, because that language doesn't sound cliched anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right, and we touched upon this a little earlier. We saw actually when there was that Iranian attack in April, at the time, there was this great crescendo of hatred towards Israel linked to the Rafah operation. Kamala Harris was saying that she'd studied the maps and there was nowhere for these civilians to go. And then in 10 days, Israel managed to evacuate 1 million civilians to northern areas of Gaza. But there was that pressure, there was that real hostility was coming to a head towards Israel. After the Iranian attack, it abated a little. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it wasn't a huge Damascene conversion, but it abated a little. And I do think that people in the West don't realize that Israel is fighting the same enemy that threatens us. And they don't realize what it takes any longer to fight for survival and to be at war and to have your back against the wall and to have to defend your way of life, your people, your values, your family. But one day, and God forbid this shouldn't happen, but if the West finds itself under a similar threat to the one that Israel is now facing, I think there would be a new alliance, a new positivity towards Israel. People would say, "Oh, that's what they're facing. That's what they're talking about. Let's get some of that." We will be looking to Israel for lessons in war fighting, because we've kind of forgotten how to do it, certainly on our own turf. I'm not alone, I think, in saying to my kids that if Britain finds itself at war, go to Israel, because at least Israel knows how to fight one. The size of the British armed forces would fit in half of Wembley Stadium. I mean, our armed forces are depleted and have been for many, many years. We're in a sorry state. We tried to test fire a Trident missile the other day, and it plopped into the sea. We tried to send an aircraft carrier out of harbour to serve, and the rusty propeller meant that it had to turn around and come back. I mean, our armed forces are not in a good way. Our culture is not in a good way with respect to defending our values. And I think that we'll have a very rude wake-up call if this does happen, and God forbid it won't. And then we'll begin to look to Israel for inspiration.
Let's hope it doesn't go there, but I definitely think the West has a lot to learn from Israel. One, on the basic level of military strategy and tactics, with Israel fighting a war in an urban battlefield that no country has ever confronted. The closest example to the Battle of Gaza is the Battle of Mosul, but that was completely different. It was 86 nations, not one nation. It was ISIS in one city, not 7.
And no Western boots on the ground. Yeah.
No Western boots on the ground. They weren't holding hostages. The Battle of Gaza is unlike anything the world has ever seen, but also the resilience and vibrancy of Israeli civil society, that sense that you have to fight for yourself and you have to take responsibility because the state isn't necessarily coming to save you, and everyone has to serve and to do their bit. And these are values that hopefully the West won't be called on to exercise, but at least I hope that they can learn to respect. Before we wrap up, I want to play a game with you. A card game. I'm calling it the Israelophobe Cyber War 4. I want to present 4 of the leading purveyors of Israelophobia. And I want you to help explain to our listeners and our viewers, who are these purveyors of Israelophobia, what's driving them, and what sort of impact are they having. The first card we have up here is Mr. Owen Jones. Who is this cheeky chappy?
Well, I mean, this is Owen Jones. He's a hard-left journalist and activist who writes for The Guardian. And since October the 7th, he has made the Palestinian cause his main obsession. again, at the risk of libel, I'm not going to start calling him names, but he does certainly hail from that hard left tradition, which actually is inspired by much of the propaganda that was produced by the Soviet Union after the 1967 Six-Day War, where the Soviet Union pumped anti-Israel, Israelophobic propaganda into the West in a huge project of trying to turn the world against Israel. And all of the tropes that we are so familiar today of genocide, white supremacy, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, Zionism is racism, that Israel is like the Nazis, all of those things were clearly lies. And they were invented by the Soviets and are articulated by people, particularly on the hard left, on the left in general, as if they are true to this day. And Owen Jones articulates them regularly.
So you see Owen Jones essentially as having been mugged by Soviet propaganda. And for those who are interested more on this subject, I recommend the episode we had with Isabella Tabarovsky here on the podcast, speaking about how Soviet propaganda has morphed into modern anti-Semitism. Next figure we have here is Mr. Mehdi Hasan. Who is he? What's his deal?
Well, Mehdi Hasan, he's another internet provocateur. He now is presenting a show for Al Jazeera. I was asked to go on it, actually, and
so was I.
Did you decline as well?
Yes,
I declined too. But I think the fact that an Al Jazeera contributor in Gaza had held hostages, Israeli hostages, was the final straw. In addition to all the other flaws with Al Jazeera and its anti-Semitic output. But Mehdi Hasan, yeah, I mean, he wrote a book called How to Win Every Argument, and then the other day proceeded to lose an argument. He tried to argue that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, but he succumbed to the talents of Douglas Murray and Natasha Hausdorff,
who absolutely wiped the floor with him. Those both come from the far left. Let's have a look at someone from a different angle. We have everyone's favorite Nazi, Jackson Hinkle. Tell us about Jackson Hinkle.
Well, Jackson Hinkle, I mean, I don't know him as well as I know the other two. In America, you do have a very active anti-Semitic far right that promotes ideas like the Great Replacement theory, that the mass immigration into the West is the fault of the Jews who are doing it to undermine society and those sorts of things. And he is, the other extreme from the two that we've looked at so far. But in a way, according to the principle of the horseshoe of politics, if you go far enough to the left, you end up on the far right, and vice versa. And
essentially, they're saying the same things about Israel? They're Israelophobic in the same way?
Well, look, there are different narratives, but they arrive at the same conclusion. I mean, we see that in Britain with Nick Griffin, the former BNP leader, who is as close as we get to a far-right figure. He is a far-right figure, but he's not as influential as those in America. But he has an alliance with Islamists, appearing on Islamist platforms and podcasts and sharing anti-Zionist tropes with them.
Sorry, you're telling me the leader of the British far-right is ganging up together with the Islamists against the Jews?
Correct.
Why? No, because one would think that the far-right hates Muslims as well, so why is he suddenly ganging up?
I mean, the thing is, it's a question, I mean, it's a varied menagerie, the far-right, as is the far-left. Extremists of all different stripes and colours and creeds. And if you begin to go towards the far right, you find people co-opting support for Israel as a way of hating Muslims. But then if you go far enough, you find the traditional anti-Semites who just hate Jews because they're Zionists.
And let's complete our hand. Our final Israelophobe is Brianna Joy Gray. Who is she? Why does she hate us?
She's a progressive television presenter and an activist in the States who rose to prominence recently when she reacted to an interview with a sister of an Israeli hostage.
Rose to prominence or fell from grace?
Well, both at once. She interviewed a sister of an Israeli hostage and reacted with a famous eye roll that was so depraved, such a depraved reaction. And she really became the face of this contemptible strain of anti-Zionist Israelophobia that isn't able to develop any compassion for a hostage. I mean, you have to be pretty low to be able to feel that, and not even be able to pretend to have sympathy. At least have the decency to pretend.
Jake Wallis Simons, editor-in-chief of the Jewish Chronicle and author of Israelophobia. There's been a fascinating discussion about how Anti-Semitism has morphed into the hatred of Israel that we see today. How can people follow you and your work?
Well, I'm on Twitter for my sins, at Jake W. Simons. Of course, the Jewish Chronicle website is thejc.com, which is brilliant. You can find the JC on Twitter as well, and on other platforms.
Okay, Jake Wallis Simons, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation. As always, if you enjoyed watching, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts. Follow us on all the social media platforms. We'll be back soon with more episodes that take us beyond the headlines and between the lines. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining us.